there are fast bikes, and then there are bikes that can kill you before you even realize you're in trouble. I'm talking about motorcycles so dangerous, they earned names like Widowmaker and sent insurance companies running for the hills. One of them racked up 127 confirmed fatalities during just 4 years of production. Another one, it killed a genuine war hero and changed motorcycle laws forever. Look, I've been riding for years, and I've seen plenty of riders get humbled by machines they thought they could handle. But the bikes we're covering today, these weren't just challenging, they were legitimately deadly. We're talking about engineering decisions that range from ambitious to downright reckless, mixed with an era when safety features often meant maybe having a front brake that worked half the time. So grab your coffee, settle in, and let's talk about 10 motorcycles that you should probably be glad you never threw a leg over. Number 10, Suzuki Hayabusa. Let's kick this off with one you've definitely heard of, the Suzuki Hayabusa. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. The Hayabusa? Really? But hear me out. When Suzuki dropped this thing in 1999, they built a motorcycle that could hit 190 miles per hour right off the showroom floor. Think about that for a second. 190. That's faster than most people will ever drive a car in their entire lives, and Suzuki just handed anyone with a motorcycle endorsement the keys to that kind of speed. The problem wasn't the bike itself. The Hayabusa is actually pretty well built. The problem is what it represents. See, this became the go-to machine for guys who wanted to chase top speed records on public roads. And brother, when you're doing 185 miles per hour on a bike that weighs over 500 pounds, there's no room for error. None. A blown tire, a bit of debris, a gust of wind, any of that, and you're not walking away. The Hayabusa spawned this whole culture of extreme speed runs. Guys would modify these things to push past 200 miles per hour. At those speeds, you've got maybe half a second to react to anything. That's not riding, that's just playing Russian roulette with physics. Suzuki eventually had to electronically limit these bikes to 186 because manufacturers were getting nervous about liability and government regulation. But the damage was done. The Hayabusa became the weapon of choice for speed demons. And let me tell you, not all of them made it home. Number 9, Kawasaki Ninja H2R. Speaking of insane speed, let's talk about Kawasaki's modern interpretation of too much is never enough. The Ninja H2R. This thing makes 326 horsepower. Let me say that again. 326 horsepower. That's more than most V8 muscle cars. On 2 wheels, with a supercharger bolted to a liter bike motor. Now, Kawasaki will tell you this is a track-only machine. And they're right. It's not even street legal. But here's the thing. They still sold them to anyone with the cash. And you know what happened. Guys took them on the street anyway. Because of course they did. The H2R is so fast, so violent in its power delivery that it would have been an absolute massacre if it had come out in the 70s or 80s. The only reason this bike isn't responsible for a body count is because it's loaded with every electronic safety system known to man. Traction control, wheelie control, launch control, cornering ABS. Without all that computer intervention, this bike would be unrideable for 99% of people. It's the perfect example of how modern technology can save us from our own stupidity. Take away those electronics, and you've got a Widowmaker that would make the old Kawasaki H2 look tame, which coincidentally brings us to our next bike. Number 8, Kawasaki H2 Mach 4. We're getting into the real meat of this list. The original Kawasaki H2 Mach 4, the bike that invented the term Widowmaker. Kawasaki released this beast in 1971, and it was a 2-stroke triple making 74 horsepower in a frame that weighed about as much as a modern dirt bike. 74 horses doesn't sound like much today, but back then, that was Formula 1 territory on 2 wheels. The problem was everything else. The frame was a flimsy tube design that flexed like a wet noodle when you got on the power. The brakes were a joke. A single disc up front that would fade after one hard stop. And the suspension, well, let's just say it had springs and some oil and leave it at that. But the real killer was the power delivery. See, 2-stroke motors don't build power gradually like a 4-stroke. They hit, and the H2's power hit like a sledgehammer right around 6,000 RPM. You'd be cruising along, twist the throttle, and suddenly the front wheel's in the air and the back end is trying to swap places with the front. Tank slappers, where the handlebars whip back and forth violently, were so common on these bikes that owners just accepted it as part of the experience. 127 people died on H2s between 1971 and 1975. 127. That's not riders making stupid choices. That's a fundamentally flawed machine. Kawasaki tried to fix it in '74 with some frame reinforcements and better suspension, but by then the damage was done. The oil crisis and emissions regulations killed it off in '75 and probably saved a bunch of lives in the process. If you see one of these today, it's probably owned by a collector who's smart enough not to actually ride it, and if you ever get offered a ride on one, just say no. Your family will thank you. Number 7. Suzuki RG500 Gamma. Alright, let's stay in the two-stroke world for a minute with the Suzuki RG500 Gamma. This was basically Suzuki taking their Grand Prix race bike and saying, let's put lights on it and sell it to the public. And somehow, that was legal. Barry Sheen raced bikes like this. These were purpose-built racing machines designed to be ridden by professionals on closed circuits with ambulances standing by. Here's how this bike worked. Below 6,000 RPM, it was a dog. Barely made any power at all. The torque didn't even register below 3,000, but then you'd hit 9,000 RPM and suddenly you'd discover what Suzuki called the second phase. The power didn't just increase, it exploded. And then at 9,600 RPM, it hit this other surge that would launch you from 9,600 to redline so fast you couldn't even process what was happening. High side crashes were epidemic with these bikes. A high side, if you don't know, is when the rear tire breaks loose, then suddenly grabs traction and catapults you over the top of the bike. It's like being thrown from a mechanical bull, except you're going 100 miles an hour when it happens. Track day guys learn to respect these bikes real quick. Street riders, a lot of them learned the hard way that there's a reason race bikes stay on the track. This thing would reach 147 miles per hour, and every one of those miles per hour felt like you were riding a lit stick of dynamite. These days, an RG500 will cost you serious money at auction. They're the third most expensive two-stroke road bike out there. But if you're smart, you'll keep it in your garage and just look at it. It's a lot safer that way. Before we get to number 6, if you're enjoying the list so far, hit like and subscribe. We cover rare and legendary motorcycles like these every week. Number 6, Yamaha VMAX. Now let's talk about a bike that's still somewhat common, the Yamaha VMAX. And I say common loosely, because if you see one on the road, there's a good chance it's being ridden very, very carefully. Yamaha built the VMAX to be Japan's answer to American muscle. They wanted a drag bike, something that would destroy everything in a straight line and look mean doing it, and they succeeded. The VMAX made 143 horsepower from a 1200C V4 motor with this party trick called V-Boost that would kick in at 4,000 RPM and feel like someone lit an afterburner. In a straight line, this thing was a monster. Problem was, Yamaha forgot to engineer the turning and stopping parts of the equation. The frame would flex under hard acceleration. The rear end would squirm around like it was trying to escape. The suspension was way too soft for a bike this heavy, 280 kilos wet, so the front end would load up like a dump truck when you hit the brakes. And cornering? Forget about it. The floorboards would scrape on anything more than a gentle curve, and the handling was so vague you never quite knew where the bike was going to end up. One magazine called it a 140 horsepower shopping trolley, totally lethal, and that's being kind. The VMAX developed this cult following among guys who like the muscle bike aesthetic, but anybody who actually pushed one hard will tell you this bike was built to go fast in one direction, and one direction only. Anything else was just asking for trouble. Yamaha made these things from 1985 to 2007, and they're still out there. If you're thinking about buying one, just remember, it gets 90 miles from a 15-liter tank because all that V4 does is burn fuel and scare riders. Number 5, Honda CBR 900R Fireblade. Here's a bike that changed everything and scared the hell out of a whole generation of riders in the process. The Honda CBR 900 RR Fireblade. When Honda released this in 1992, they did something revolutionary. They made a 900cc bike that weighed less than a 600, 185 kilograms with 122 horsepower. That power to weight ratio was unheard of. It was like Honda took a scalpel and just started shaving weight off everything until they couldn't shave anymore. They even put a 16-inch front wheel on it to save weight and make it more flickable. And it worked. The Fireblade was so agile, so responsive that it would change direction if you looked at it wrong. For experienced riders, this was a revelation. For new riders, it was a death trap. That bike was so light and so powerful that it would get away from you before you even realized you'd made a mistake. The throttle response was instant. The handling was razor sharp. There was no forgiveness built into it anywhere. Insurance companies took one look at the accident rates and basically said, we're not covering this. They literally called it one of 5 motorcycles too dangerous for new riders. And they weren't wrong. The later CBR 954RR that came out in 2002 was even worse. Or better, depending on how you look at it. That thing weighed just 168 kilos dry with 136 horsepower at the rear wheel. It was like riding a superbike made of carbon fiber and bad decisions. Honda eventually tamed the Fireblade down, added more weight, more electronics, made it more manageable. But those early models, brother, you had to have your act together to ride one of those and not end up as a statistic. Number 4, Suzuki TL1000R. Suzuki had this brilliant idea in the late 90s. They'd build a V-twin superbike to compete in World Superbike racing. They'd make it powerful, make it fast, and they'd dominate the championship. That bike was the TL1000R, except it was a complete disaster. The R was the racing version of the already sketchy TL1000S that we'll get to in a minute. Suzuki took that bike, added more power, 135 horses from the V-twin, and somehow made it handle even worse. The power delivery was all wrong. Down low, it was snatchy and unpredictable. Then above 5,000 RPM, it would just take off, and the power felt like it would keep building forever. Sounds great, except the chassis couldn't handle it. The thing was too heavy, 197 kilos, which was 20 kilos more than the Yamaha R1, and it didn't handle worth a damn. Suzuki tried to race it in World Superbike. They showed up for one race, got demolished, and never came back. That's how bad it was. Even professional racers with factory support couldn't make this bike competitive, but they sold them to the public anyway, and people bought them because on paper they looked good. In reality, you had a bike that was too heavy, too powerful, with handling that was questionable at best and downright dangerous at worst. The TL1000R stayed in production until 2004, but by then everybody knew what it was. A failed race bike that Suzuki dumped on the public. If you see one today, chances are it's owned by someone who likes the challenge of riding a difficult bike, and more power to them, because that's exactly what it is, difficult and dangerous. Number 3, Suzuki TL1000S. Before the TL1000R, there was the TL1000S, and in some ways, it was even worse. Suzuki released the S in 1997 to compete with the Ducati 916. They built a 9-turn 96cc V-twin that made 125 horsepower and massive torque. But here's where it went wrong. Instead of using a proper shock absorber in the rear, they used this rotary damper system to save weight and money. That rotary damper was junk. Under hard riding, it would overheat and lose all its damping. And when that happened, the rear end would start hopping around, which would transfer to the front end. And before you knew it, you were in a full-on tank slapper at 100 miles per hour. The crashes started almost immediately. Multiple high-profile accidents, including fatalities. Suzuki finally issued a recall and installed steering dampers on all of them, but the damage was done. The TL1000S had earned a reputation as a bike that would try to kill you without warning. Here's the crazy part. It won Bike of the Year and Worst Bike of the Year in the same year from different magazines. That's how polarizing it was. Some riders loved the power and the torque. Others, the ones who survived the tank slappers, wouldn't touch one with a 10-foot pole. Despite all that, the TL1000S became a cult bike. bike. It's got this mystique now, like it's a machine that only skilled riders can handle. And maybe that's true, but it's also true that it's a fundamentally flawed motorcycle that killed people because Suzuki cut corners on the suspension. If you ever get a chance to ride one, my advice is simple: don't. Number 2, Vincent Black Shadow. Let's go way back now, back to the 1940s and 50s to a British motorcycle company called Vincent. They built the Black Shadow and it was the fastest production bike in the world at the time. It was also absolutely gorgeous. I mean, this bike was a work of art. All that polished aluminum and black paint, the distinctive V-twin motor, the cantilever rear suspension, it looked like something from the future. But here's the thing about the future in 1948. It didn't have good brakes, or a stiff frame, or suspension that could handle the power it was making. The Vincent Black Shadow could reach speeds that nobody, and I mean nobody, should have been going on 1940s technology. The brakes were pathetic. Asking it to stop was more like asking nicely and hoping it agreed. The frame would flex and bend in corners, and you never quite knew which way the bike was going to go. It was a bike that was about 20 years ahead of its time in power, but the chassis and suspension were still stuck in the 1930s. That's a recipe for disaster, and plenty of riders found that out the hard way. These days, a Vincent Black Shadow is worth serious money, 6 figures easy if you can find one. But that's because they're rare and beautiful, not because they're good motorcycles. If you actually ride one, you're reminded real quick why old British bikes have the reputation they do. They're fast enough to get you in trouble and not nearly good enough to get you out of it. Number 1, Bra Superior SS100. And that brings us to number 1, the bike that started it all, the grandfather of deadly motorcycles, the Bra Superior SS100. George Bra built these bikes in the 1920s and 30s, and each one was custom made for its owner. Every single SS100 was guaranteed to hit 100 miles per hour. That guarantee was stamped right on the tank. And remember, this was an era when most motorcycles barely made 15 horsepower and topped out around 60 miles per hour. The SS100 made anywhere from 50 to 75 horsepower, depending on the configuration. That's 5 times more powerful than anything else on the road. It was called the Rolls-Royce of motorcycles, and it cost about as much as a house. But here's the problem. This was the 1920s. There was no such thing as a disc brake. Helmets weren't mandatory. The suspension was basically springs and hope. And yet these bikes could reach speeds that would be respectable even today. And one of the most famous owners of a Bra Superior was T.E. Lawrence. Lawrence of Arabia, war hero, genuine legend. He loved his bra, called it Boa because it was so fast and so powerful. On May 13th, 1935, Lawrence was riding his SS100 on a road in Dorset, England. He came over a hill doing about 60 miles per hour and encountered 2 boys on bicycles. He swerved to avoid them, lost control, and was thrown from the bike. He wasn't wearing a helmet because helmets weren't required. 6 days later, he died from his injuries. He was 46 years old. Lawrence's death was a wake-up call, a war hero, one of the most famous men in Britain, killed on a motorcycle. The public outcry led to studies on motorcycle safety and eventually to laws requiring helmets. One death changed motorcycle regulation forever. That's the legacy of the Bra Superior SS100. It was a magnificent machine, a technical achievement that was decades ahead of its time. But it was also a killer because the technology to make it safe simply didn't exist yet. One of these bikes sold at auction for over $370,000. But nobody really rides them anymore. They're museum pieces now, reminders of an era when engineers built whatever they could imagine and riders just had to deal with the consequences. And there you have it, 10 motorcycles that earned their deadly reputations through blood and physics. From the Bra Superior that killed a war hero to the Kawasaki H2 that racked up 127 fatalities in 4 years. These bikes weren't just fast or powerful, they were fundamentally flawed machines that asked more of their riders than most riders could give. If you rode any of these bikes back in the day and you're still here watching this video, I want to hear about it. Drop your stories in the comments. And if you learned something today, hit that like button and subscribe. We've got plenty more motorcycle history coming your way.